All right, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the virtual forum for the House Joint Resolution 542, Virginia Transit Equity and Modernization Study. My name is Grant Sparks, and I'm the Acting Chief of Public Transportation at the Virginia Department of Rail and Public Transportation, or DRPT, and I'm also the DRPT Project Manager for this important initiative. Kimley Horn was selected as the lead consultant for this study, and joining me from that team this morning, we have Danielle McCrae, Melissa Dumond, and Jessica Lawless, all of which have been instrumental in the development of this study. And then last but certainly not least, joining us in the audience today is Delegate Dolores McQuinn, who sponsored the House Joint Resolution in 2021 that led to the development of this study. Delegate McQuinn represents the Commonwealth 70th District, which is made up of parts of Chesterfield and Henrico counties, as well as the city of Richmond. She has served in the Virginia General Assembly since 2009. She's a member of the Transportation Committee, and she's been a longtime advocate for a multimodal transportation system in Virginia. So thank you for being here with us today, Delegate McQuinn. Next slide, please. So before we get started, I will mention that we are recording this forum, and we do plan on posting it shortly after this forum concludes. So please be aware of that if you miss any of it. And I guess I'll just dive right in. So today the DRPT and Kimley Horn teams are excited to provide an update on our progress with regards to the House Joint Resolution 542 Virginia Transit Equity and Modernization Study. We do understand that members in the audience have a varying degree of exposure and understanding as to what the study is. For some of you, this is your first time hearing about the study, but we also have some in the audience who've participated directly in the study. So to that end, during the first portion of this forum, we will be providing a very brief overview of the study and the legislation that led to its development. We will summarize what we heard during our outreach efforts with regards to the transit equity and modernization efforts. We will discuss the state of transit in Virginia. From there, we will be pivoting to discuss the action planning efforts that we've been busy working on over the last few months. And we'll discuss next steps in the study development process. And we'll close out by hopefully taking a few questions at the very end of the forum. Next slide, please. So just a few housekeeping items. We do have a ton of content to share today, but we'd like to make this an interactive experience. So throughout the presentation, we will have some live polls that look like the image on the left of your screen. We will cue you when it's time to respond to a poll, and you can make your selection directly in the GoToWebinar platform. And for questions and answers, we ask people to submit their questions in advance of the forum to help us manage the allotted meeting time. We will respond to as many of those pre-submitted questions as we can at the end of the presentation. But if you have any other questions, you can submit them in the question box on your screen, and we will follow up directly with you after the conclusion of the webinar. And then you can always also submit your questions and feedback through the study website, which is www.vatransitmodernization.com. Next slide. So now we will launch into our first polling question. What region of Virginia are you currently located in? And I'll give everybody a few moments to select their response. All right, Miriam, if you could close the poll, please. So it looks like a lot of folks are from the Lynchburg or Richmond area. Actually, a pretty good distribution from all the different districts and regions in the Commonwealth, which is good. Thank you. All right, next slide, please. So as I mentioned, we'll start off with a brief overview of the study. Next slide. So first, how did we get here? In 2021, the Virginia General Assembly passed House Joint Resolution 542, which requires DRPT to prepare a study that explores a variety of topics in an effort to advance transit equity and modernization efforts throughout the Commonwealth. Those topics are at the very bottom of your screen in the colored boxes. They include transit accessibility, the adequacy of transit infrastructure, transit electrification, emerging technologies in transit, transit safety, and transit system engagement and governance. The resolution also requires that DRPT emphasizes engagement opportunities for underrepresented and underserved communities during the study. In terms of study goals, at the onset of the study, we identified a handful of just high-level study goals. Three of the overarching goals for what we wanted to accomplish in the study included the identification of transit agency, rider, and stakeholder needs. We wanted to develop an action plan to address those needs, and we also wanted to define underrepresented and underserved communities, so better understand who these individuals are and where these communities are located. We also wanted to be very clear as to what we did not intend on accomplishing in this study, which included that we did not want to create a new asset inventory, and we did not want to single out any transit agencies for poor performance. We did try our best throughout the study to keep themes and takeaways at the statewide and regional levels. Next slide. So I mentioned the 6 topic areas that the study was required to address. Along with those topic areas, there were a handful of analyses and issues that the study team wanted to tackle. We wanted to conduct an opportunities or gap assessment of transit service to identify the locations of underserved areas in the Commonwealth. We wanted to better understand the needs and barriers to improve transit infrastructure, in particular the infrastructure at and adjacent to bus stops. We wanted to look for opportunities to reduce the Commonwealth's carbon footprint through transit electrification and get a better understanding of the costs and infrastructure requirements associated with conversion to battery electric buses. We also wanted to identify strategies to inform the implementation of emerging technologies in the transit industry. And we also wanted to develop a framework for identifying and engaging disadvantaged and underserved communities. Next slide. So our team broke the study into 3 phases. The first phase involved the collection and review of existing data at the state level from transit agencies, from MPOs and localities, and any other sources that were relevant to the topics addressed in House Joint Resolution 542. This first phase concluded last summer, and then we moved into phase 2, which was the identification of transit needs and opportunities. Much of our public outreach and engagement efforts occurred during this phase, which carried us through to the beginning of the winter and the submission of our interim study report to the General Assembly, which was in December of 2021. And then as we rolled into the new year, the team shifted to the final phase of the study, which is the strategies and action planning phase, which we are wrapping up right now. Once this phase is completed, which we anticipate occurring in the next couple months, we will be pulling all of the materials together and we'll be submitting a final report to the General Assembly this August. Next slide. So now we'll go into our second polling question. How have you engaged with the study before? I'll give you a few moments to make your selection. All right, Miriam, if you want to close that poll. So it looks like we have almost half of the individuals on this call, 43%. This is the first engagement, which is great. Then a handful have participated either through the study website, have shared their transit story on our website, or have participated in focus groups or stakeholder meetings. Great. All right. I think we have another polling question for you. How would you describe yourself? Just trying to learn a little bit more about those of you on the call today. So again, we'll give you a few moments to make your selection. All right, Miriam, if you want to close the poll. Great. So another diverse response. A lot of folks are transit agency representatives or staff. We have some elected or government officials, riders, community organizers, as well as other. Great. All right. So that wraps up the study overview. Now I'll provide a brief summary of our data collection and outreach efforts. If you could move to the next slide. So as part of our study's public participation plan, we formed a number of groups and launched a few initiatives to gather as much input as we could in a fairly short amount of time. Moving from left to right in this graphic, we conducted a series of focus group meetings to engage with transit riders in both urban and rural areas across the Commonwealth in an effort to better understand rider needs as it relates to the study topic areas. Focus group participants included frequent riders, infrequent riders, transit stakeholders, transit advisory council members, as well as individuals with disabilities who use transit. The study team also launched a Share Your Transit Story campaign to solicit rider experiences using public transit. Specifically, we asked riders to describe how access to transit services played a role in their life. And we also asked them to describe their priorities for modernizing and growing transit in their community. I already mentioned this, but we did collect and analyze a number of data sets at the transit agency and statewide levels. We also organized a Transit Equity and Modernization Committee, which includes 12 transit executives from across the Commonwealth, and we asked them to provide input and help us advise the study findings and outcomes. We also created 4 technical working groups comprised of local transit agency staff, stakeholders, and partner organizations to really dig into these various study topic areas and get diverse perspectives from those groups, brainstorm unconstrained ideas, explore feasibility and implementation barriers, and provide input on our study recommendations. And then the last item on the right, we distributed a comprehensive transit agency survey to all 39 transit agencies in the Commonwealth, which included dozens of questions about those 6 technical topic areas. As part of this effort, we were pleased to receive a 100% response rate on that survey. Next slide. So this graphic provides a little bit more detail on the data that we collected during that first phase of the study. I won't touch on all of these items, but as you can see, we collected a wide variety of information, including GIS data, governing board requirements for transit agencies, agency outreach plans, Title VI plans, transit strategic plans, and really any other materials that were relevant to the study's development. All of the information that we received and analyzed fed into the baseline conditions assessment document, which is a comprehensive resource that's posted on the study website. Next slide. So as I mentioned a couple slides back, the Transit Equity and Modernization Committee that was formed includes executives from transit agencies across the Commonwealth, and the purpose of this committee was to provide guidance and perspective to the study team's efforts and provide some informed feedback to help the study team develop an actionable study. We've had really great dialogue with this committee throughout the study development process. One of the work products that came out of that dialogue included the identification of 4 goal statements for modernizing transit in the Commonwealth. So those 4 goal statements are on your screen. For safety and operations, this group wanted to ensure the dignity of operators and employees with protections for their well-being and safety, fair and intentional hiring practices, and competitive wages. For performance and funding, the group wanted to support measures that enable equitable service growth as it relates to vulnerable populations, the environment, and the economy. For connectivity and access, the group wanted to upgrade technology and address travel barriers in the region to provide future improvements that optimize reliability, access, affordability, and multimodal connections. And with respect to education and engagement, the group wanted to develop meaningful public engagement methods and expand transit use through education and activities which inform and empower the public to influence transit decision making. Next slide. So similar to the Transit Equity and Modernization Committee, we've had some thought-provoking and enlightening conversations with members of the study's technical working groups. While there are a number of key themes and takeaways that have come out of those groups, we've highlighted a few of them on this slide. Just to touch on a few, with respect to transit accessibility, we identified a desire and need to better integrate land use and transit planning before new development occurs, so that transit can be seamlessly integrated into the design of the development, rather than attempting to add transit service to a new development after it has already been built out. In our adequacy of infrastructure group, we heard a need for a statewide standard for bus stop design and placement, which would allow for more consistency of bus stop design and amenities between communities. And then also with respect to transit bus electrification, we heard that there was a significant knowledge gap in understanding battery electric buses and their requirements, such as utility infrastructure needs. These are just some snapshots of those takeaways. We do have far more materials on our study website, so I encourage all of you to check those out. Next slide. So some of the highlights from the transit agency survey that I mentioned, we heard from many transit agencies that additional funding is needed in order to implement meaningful and equitable improvements to their transit systems. In general, most transit agencies felt that they understood where equity could be improved, but they felt that they lacked the resources to do anything about it. We also heard that there's a strong desire to implement newer technologies to enhance transit service, but again, more funding would be needed to do so. And then we also heard that written policy guidance was needed to make advancements in equity. Again, there are many other survey takeaways. These are just some of the few highlights from that survey. Next slide. And then quickly, just to provide a recap of what we heard during our focus group meetings. Again, these focus groups were with transit riders. We heard that there is significant support for the concept of transit equity. Participants did, however, express some concern for how this will be put into practice at the local level. We heard that there were several common barriers to just using transit, including lack of familiarity with the transit systems. There were some safety concerns, long travel times, access to bus stops and stations was a common barrier, and overall reliability of transit services. One of the big themes of this study was that basic infrastructure is of great concern to the transit rider. Riders expressed a widespread lack of basic bus stop features such as shelters, seating, lighting, and sidewalk connections. Health and safety of riders, as well as bus operators, is top of mind, especially in light of the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. And last but not least, most riders do not feel as though they have a voice in public transit decision making in their communities. There is widespread concern over this. Next slide. And I also mentioned earlier that we initiated this Share Your Transit Story campaign as part of the study. This slide shows excerpts from a few of the comments that we received as part of this initiative. The full list of comments that we received are, of course, in our study materials, but we thought we'd share just a few with you. Next slide. All right, so now I will turn it over to the Kimley Horn team to walk us through the state of transit in Virginia.
Thanks, Grant. So now we'll talk a bit about the findings and our analysis that was completed to really understand the state of transit in Virginia. Next slide. As part of our analysis, we identified several findings to support what we understand the state of transit to be throughout the state. This is a full list of the findings that came out of our interim report completed in December of 2021. And that report is available on the project website. The findings crossed over many of the technical areas or all of the technical areas that Grant previously mentioned. The same icons that were used for the technical areas are represented here. In some cases, many of the findings cross over multiple topics, and you'll continue to see these icons throughout the remainder of the presentation. You can visit the website for a full list and more details on each of these findings, but at this time, we're going to take a deeper dive into a few of these findings to better understand what the state of transit is. Next slide. One of the first findings we'll discuss is the need for more and better data. What we came to understand is that there are gaps in available data, both at the local and state level, and there's a need for more consistency across all data sets in format and also the availability of data to make informed and equitable decisions. The table to the right gives a summary of the availability of data on bus stops and connectivity. But before we get into the data, I want to mention a few terms that you'll see. First is fixed route service. So think about fixed route service with designated bus stops where a rider will go to that bus stop to be picked up by the bus. Enhanced fixed route service is similar to that fixed route service, but it comes at a higher and more frequent interval. And then on-demand service is where people make requests for service in advance of the trip, and then they are picked up at their door. So those are the three types of services. This table shows that geospatial data is available by transit agencies, and the National Transit Database reporter status is shown here. That's the type of the report by service provided, and it indicates the relative size of the agency. For context, a full reporter is the largest agency. And what we understand is that while all agencies have geospatial data on bus stops, you'll see that fewer of them have inventory on benches and shelters. So only 4 agencies have data on benches available at bus stops, and shelter information is a total of 6. So consistency across agencies on the format and type of data would help us better make informed and equitable decisions, and there's an opportunity for improvement here. Next slide. The next challenge I want to discuss is connecting land use planning and transit planning to make better and coordinated decisions. We came to understand that there is a lack of clear ownership and responsibility regarding improving bus stops and infrastructure around the state. There is not a standardized process, and the images on the right illustrates the different types of infrastructure available throughout the state. A combination of multiple stakeholders. There are a lot of stakeholders involved in making decisions about basic infrastructure at bus stops. And those stakeholders range from property owners to roadway designers, transit agencies, and your local jurisdictions. Elevating the importance of basic infrastructure within the existing funding program is a great opportunity for us to make improvements and consistency across the state. Along with providing more consistent resources and design guidance is an opportunity for improvement also to address this challenge. Next slide. Another challenge that I want to speak to is that we observe that as you move away from the urban environment, connectivity of sidewalks certainly differed. We went into the study certainly understanding and hearing that connectivity to bus stops is a great concern. And through our transit agency survey and also from focus groups, we heard that that many felt like they had bus stops that were not well connected to sidewalks. 79% of Virginia transit agencies self-reported that they had bus stops that were not well connected. And that was a perception we went into the study with. And understanding that, we found that there was an opportunity for us to provide better and safe access to bus stops, especially in neighborhoods and communities that rely mostly on transit service. Walking away from that perception, or first going into this perception, we wanted to take a deeper dive and better understand what data showed us. So next slide. We completed an assessment and sampled bus stops around the state and realized that the perception is not quite accurate. As we took a closer look and evaluated bus stops all around the state of Virginia, we found that the bus stops are presently or currently located in more urban forms. So in your urban dense areas, whether it's the central business district areas, that's where you have a greater number of bus stops, and they are in decent shape. The real issue is that as you get out of those urban areas and move further away to suburban areas and more rural areas, there's less connectivity to our transit systems to provide connections for the first mile, last mile of a person's trip. And this brings us back to understanding where people live and where those services, where transit services are provided. We need to better understand what connectivity means in different areas of the state to make those strategic investment decisions and better serve our riders. This also reminds us of the importance to connect land use planning with our investments in transit systems. And Melissa's going to talk a bit more about that later in the webinar. Next slide. Now we'll talk about available coverage and transit service in the state of Virginia. This slide gives us a snapshot of existing transit service provided in the state, and the availability or supply, if you will, is considered high. There are, though, gaps when we think about access to people and jobs, and there is a potential to address this unmet demand. And this graph on the right shows the delta of 1.1 million people without access to fixed route transit and approximately 570,000 jobs. And those are potential gaps that may be addressed with better or enhanced fixed route service, not enhanced fixed route service, but fixed route service transit to meet those demands. And so while we have coverage around the state of Virginia, there are opportunities to meet that unmet demand. And more importantly, focus on or look and explore how state funding formulas may be set up to address that unmet and potential demand. Next slide. This statewide map illustrates where potential demand exists. So I spoke about supply and demand of transit service. This map illustrates where fixed route service is. First, that purple shade, the first purple shade on the left, and the legend illustrates where jurisdictions are served by fixed route service. There's a darker purple that shows where enhanced fixed route service stops are provided around the state, and the lighter purple illustrates where on-demand service exists. The hatched out areas indicates where there is an opportunity for demand, where demand is higher than supply of transit is available. And so wherever you see the hatched out areas, that indicates that there's a potential to address the transit gap that I previously mentioned on the earlier slide. And this map is available on the study website. Jessica will walk you through it shortly, and you can zoom in and take a closer look at your area or your jurisdiction to understand what the transit service availability is, and if there's demand or opportunity for improvements in your area. Next slide. There are many factors that we consider when we're thinking about investments in public infrastructure. And this concept of access to opportunity, or A2O, is based on identifying and quantifying opportunities for people to access higher paying jobs, healthcare, grocery stores, and other destinations. This is specific to fixed route transit across the state. And so we applied this concept, understanding that there's a basic planning principle that if you provide access to opportunities to people, they have an opportunity to be economically prosperous and thrive. The inputs to this concept are shown on the left. You have the transit coverage, jobs, and destinations. On the right are the outputs, and that's a score on a scale or a spectrum of 0 to 1. The closer you are to 1, the greater access you have to opportunity, um, or greater access to those opportunities or destinations. And at the local level, if we were to think about a transit story, so if I were to take this bigger concept and apply it to the local level, I'm reminded of a transit story we received from a woman in Hampton Roads who depends on transit to get around and commute. And when she learned about light rail service from her coworker, she expressed to us that now she's able to take that service and get to the John F. Shopping Center at a much faster rate, and it reduces her travel time. It eliminates her from having to take transfers. And this is an example of how access to opportunity is increased, if you will, for this individual. So when access to opportunity is applied or increased, people have enhanced opportunity for a better quality of life. Next slide. So this map illustrates the A2O scores from around the state. The score is based on the total number of jobs and destinations, which I previously mentioned, within a transit travel shed. And the closer you are to 1, the darker the blue is, or the greater the intensity. The lighter the blue, the closer a score is to 0. This is one of the many tools that are available on our project study website, and you can explore on your own time and take a closer look at your local jurisdiction. Now, Jessica is going to walk us through the website.
Thanks, Danielle. Yeah, so I just want to, we mentioned the website a number of times. I want to take you guys there and make sure you understand what's available to you. So when you come to the website, you'll see a homepage with some study overview, and we're trying to highlight some of the most important materials, including the draft action plan, which we're going to talk about in a minute. But if you go to resources, you'll see a lot of those documents that we've been talking about, the interim report. Here's an executive summary, or we'll call it the Cliff Notes version of the interim report, and a baseline conditions and needs assessment memo. I want to point you specifically to the interactive story map of our initial findings and opportunities, because a lot of the data that we've been plotting on a map of Virginia is here and is zoomable, and you can really dive in a little bit more closely. So it's a single page scrolling. You'll come to maps like this one that have toggles for showing the transit service areas or hiding them, as the case may be. As on each map, you have an opportunity to zoom in. So on this map showing our vulnerable populations, which are described above, we can turn on a transit service area and zoom in on some place like Harrisonburg and be able to see more closely the range of vulnerable populations, with the darker color being higher vulnerability, and the lighter colors being lower vulnerability. Now continue down scrolling. So we have a lot of great information just about transit today, and then the 10 findings that Danielle mentioned. For several of the findings, again, you'll see some maps and data. Here is that access to opportunity map. So I want to take an opportunity here to kind of zoom in on our Hampton Roads area and see, the variation of access, and you can do this, on your own as well, to kind of look at parts of Virginia that are of interest to you. On any of the maps, if you hit this home button, it'll reset you back to the full state. And so this is a great resource and a little bit easier to get into the details on than, you know, than say a PDF. So that is available to you at batransitmodernization.com. I'm going to flip back to our presentation and hand it over to Grant to run another poll.
Great, thank you, Jessica. So now we'll just hop into this next poll. The question is, which of these findings resonates the most with you? And there are a few options, and like the other ones, we will give you a few moments to make your selection. All right, Miriam, if you could close the poll, please. So 40% of respondents selected that infrastructure is insufficient, resonated the most with them, followed by the availability of transit in Virginia is high, but gaps do exist. Some folks like the many poorly placed bus stops and bad connection to sidewalks resonated with them, and then 13% said that more and better data is needed to make informed decisions resonated the most with them. Thank you. All right, and so I think Melissa is now going to give us an update on our action planning efforts.
Yes, thank you, Grant. So building on the assessment of transit in the Commonwealth and what we heard from riders, stakeholders, industry experts, other focus group members, and our transit agencies, we moved into defining what implementation would look like, or action planning. So next slide. Yeah, there you go. Here's how the process evolved. We started with the facts garnered from the baseline conditions and needs assessment, and we developed a universe of ideas that could address the Commonwealth's needs. We vetted and further expanded those concepts through ideation with the full DRPT team, our working groups, our stakeholder groups, industry experts, and transit agencies. And then we moved into prioritization of these ideas. We're going to walk through an example set of the draft strategies today, but they're also posted on the website that Jessica talked about on the resources page. We'd really like your feedback, so please do take a look at the draft action summary on the website. I think you will appreciate it. Next slide. Through this process of developing concepts to address the needs we identified statewide, we realized there were common themes that cut across multiple topic areas. So here they are. Improving data collection, management, and sharing standards, providing technical support and guidance to local transit agencies, providing guidance that includes best practices for fair and modern transit, increasing coordination collaboration between transit agencies, community organizations, institutions, localities, employers, and regional planning bodies, and incorporating modernization into fair and just decision-making processes. These were our program-wide cross-cutting themes. Next slide. So now we're going to walk you through some of the actions and focus on anticipated rider benefits from those actions. Next slide. So let me show you what you're going to see in the action plan that's available on the website. So the table on the right-hand side of the screen here lists the actions, then its associated level of effort, agency benefits, rider benefits, and then again, you see the icon, which is the topic area where the original need was identified. Next slide. What do we mean by agency benefits? These actions would result in more informed decision-making, more efficient allocation of resources. This could be money, human capital, increased coordination with partner agencies where we can accomplish more together, sharing knowledge of industry best practices, new or improved metrics and measures to track performance so we know how we're doing and what needs to be improved, and additional funding opportunities and more coordinated opportunities. Next slide. In terms of rider benefits, these actions would result in higher quality infrastructure, centering rider needs in our processes and decision making, having state-of-the-art technologies, having a better customer experience, in new or enhanced transit service, and involvement in decision making. Next slide. So from a rider's perspective, the actions listed here would result in higher quality transit infrastructure, and I'm going to walk you through a couple of these. As Danielle talked about earlier, we would achieve higher quality transit infrastructure if we streamline coordination among stakeholders and prioritize improvements at and around bus stops. So this action aims at guidance and best practice development in the topic area to better inform our transit agencies and our state overall. And to be clear on defining higher quality transit infrastructure, this action would specify by way of technical guidance or policy-specific stop design elements and development. Here are actions focused on improvements to processes that address rider needs. I'm going to walk you through these as well. This is an example of focusing on rider needs. So developing best practices for transit service development and land use planning to create more accessible transit systems. This could be best practices for expanding transit systems to places where there's higher density development or as the precursor to more dense development, combined with zoning and land use designation changes and in coordination with local jurisdictions. This can also mean in rural areas, understanding where riders live, what their service area needs are, and strategically providing better connections to transit. Here are two actions focused on more development of inclusive public engagement approaches as an outcome, believing that that would result in better communication and more informed riders. Danielle talked about how transit can be the means for access to different opportunities, be it jobs, food, education, housing, or medical resources, to name a few. We also developed actions to ensure we've not only qualitative measures of service that promotes access to these opportunities, but also quantitative measures. We believe that's really important. These actions would provide state-of-the-art transit technology to Virginians. I'm going to walk you through these. So here's an action to develop goals for electrification of fleet and transition planning from diesel to electric statewide. Having a statewide goal is important to accomplishing what you're trying to do at a local level. These goals identify regular assessment of industry innovations and technology planning to advance the use of cutting-edge technologies, so we can learn from successes of other states or ongoing industry projects, and that's the concept here. And lastly, related to increased use of state-of-the-art technologies, we suggest use of common data specification, such as general transit feed specification, across agencies and publicly available so that apps can be developed for things like real-time arrival information. So you're not standing out in the rain waiting for the bus any longer than you absolutely have to. The following actions would result in enhanced customer experience. I'm going to walk you through these. Better coordination and communication with public safety agencies and community partners to enhance rider safety and related issues would enhance the customer experience in transit. From a safety perspective, we heard from our focus groups and industry experts the need to address crime on transit and better educate existing and future riders. By delving into design solutions that prevent crime and conveying rules and manners of riding transit, we believe can lead to a better experience for riders. These actions would expand the public's role in transit decision making. I'm going to walk you through these. So here's an example of the creation of rider advisory councils. We have these examples around the nation. They affect change and ensure the public weighs in on decisions affecting transit agencies. We believe this is a means to better and more fully educate riders and give them a seat at the table. These actions relate to new or enhanced transit service. I'm going to walk you through one of these. So again, the connection of land use planning and transit planning comes into play here. If we understand where riders live and what their service needs are, we can provide better connections to transit with a focus on historically underserved populations and populations who really need it. I'm going to hand it over to Grant to walk through a couple of questions.
Great, thank you, Melissa. So now we'll launch into our next poll. This question asks, which action area of the ones that we just described are you most interested in? Is it accessibility, adequacy of infrastructure, emerging technology and electrification, system engagement and governance, or transit safety? I'll give everybody a few moments to make their selection. All right, Miriam, if you could close the poll, please. All right, looks like a lot of folks are interested in accessibility, that action area. Not surprising, we heard that as well throughout the study development process, as well as adequacy of infrastructure. Both of those topics were top of mind as we developed the study. Thank you. Now I think we're going to move into another polling question. Which of the anticipated rider benefits is most important to you? Is it higher quality transit infrastructure, enhanced customer experience, new or enhanced transit service, increased use of state-of-the-art transit technologies, or expanded involvement in decision making? We'll give you a few minutes to make your selection. All right, if you could please. So over half of participants said that new or enhanced transit service was the rider benefit that is most important to them, followed by higher quality transit infrastructure. Excellent, thank you. All right, so now I'll just discuss some next steps for the study team. Next slide, please. As I mentioned earlier on, we'll be drafting our final study report over the next couple months. But before we finalize anything, we will be seeking feedback on our study action plan. Shortly after this forum concludes, we'll be distributing a final transit agency survey to all 39 transit agencies in the Commonwealth to solicit feedback on our action planning documents. And then in parallel with that solicitation, we've also opened a public comment period for the study's draft action plan, which is currently available on the study website. That public comment period will be open through May 13th, and you can see on the screen, it is available on the study website, www.vatransitmodernization.com. Next slide, please. So that concludes our presentation, and now we'd like to take some questions from the audience. We did ask virtual forum registrants to submit their questions in advance. And I know we've received a number of them, so we'll be taking those questions first. And I think, Danielle, you were going to read off the questions for us?
Yes, I've got the first one here for you, Grant. Has DRPT considered partnering with the transit app so that live tracking and route planning for all Virginia transit systems can be found in one free app instead of many agencies creating and maintaining their own apps of a lower quality and functionality?
Yeah, so that's a good question. Standardizing real-time bus tracking across Virginia would be incredible, and I think it's something that DRPT would certainly like to work towards. But it is not as easy as contracting with a third-party app provider such as the transit app. The big issue is actually with the format of the real-time data and whether it's publicly available. Not all transit agencies use the same technology vendor for their real-time vehicle tracking, and these vendors often have data output formats that are inconsistent and/or proprietary, so they're not always publicly available or shareable. And that's why you often have to download a very specific application on your smartphone in order to access real-time bus tracking. DRPT's focus, and we've even identified this through the study action plan, was that we should be doing more to encourage and promote the use of standardized real-time data formats, such as General Transit Feed Specification or GTFS real-time formats that are used by Google Maps and other third-party applications. If our transit agencies can work with their technology vendors to get their real-time data into an open GTFS real-time format, then it would be possible for all third-party apps, including the transit app, to include this data in whether it's certain regions or even across the state. So great question, but in order to do that, a lot would need to fall into place.
Okay, thank you for that response. The next question we have is, what recommendations were made to ensure that fleet electrification does not negatively impact the existing transit workforce?
Yeah, another good question. This can be simple in some ways and very complex in others. For anything that will be new or change a process or a skill set, we are recommending improved workforce development. Transit agencies should put plans in place based on their specific needs with respect to workforce development and understanding of battery electric fleets to ensure that staffing positions are appropriately adjusted to meet those needs. Frontline positions like bus operators likely require some training, but they can function in the same manner whether it's a diesel bus or a battery electric bus. Other positions, however, like a diesel engine mechanic, may be phased out. But at the same time, we're also anticipating that newer positions will likely be created, whether it's an electrical and software engineer to work on the electric propulsion, whether it's a chemical engineer, an electrical systems management engineer, someone who's working on the bus chargers. So we are anticipating that there will be a shift. But as some positions are phased out, those positions that are have traditionally been for diesel engines, we're expecting newer ones to be created. Now, we do want to stress that it may be too early to really understand how all positions will be affected by bus electrification. Therefore, we're stressing the need to research and plan accordingly for this change. I should also mention that DRPT does plan to develop a statewide transit electrification plan after the conclusion of the study, which will allow us a little bit more time to really dive into some of these more complex issues.
Okay. The next question we have is, transit-related solutions look different in rural versus urban contexts. How did the analysis and recommendations take into account that there are unique community needs and contexts that are different? The contexts should be those contexts should be considered. For example, not one size will fit all.
Right. So the DRPT and Kimley Horn study teams acknowledge that there are very different needs depending on the different communities. So throughout our analysis and throughout the study development process of generating a statewide understanding of these various issues, but also trying to include the local context wherever we could. So the actions and recommendations in the action plan are written to be flexible and support local agencies in decision making and developing solutions that work within their own communities.
Okay.
And Danielle, I think we have time for one more question, and then we'll probably have to wrap up.
Okay, this will be the last question. Were all transit agencies included in Virginia included in the study? How were the structures of different agencies incorporated in the findings and actions?
Yeah, so the analysis that we conducted and did include all 39 transit agencies in the Commonwealth, with the exception of WMATA in the Northern Virginia region. Within the 39 transit agencies that were included, there were small, large, fixed route, enhanced fixed route, and demand response providers. Just to note that access to opportunities and transit gap analysis is based on fixed and enhanced fixed route service providers. So the actions aim to provide transit agencies of all sizes with the tools to determine what solutions work best for their agencies and their local context. So just to kind of wrap us up here, I did just want to thank everybody again for joining today. I know we've mentioned this a number of times on the virtual forum, but the draft action plan summary is available on the study website. Again, it's www.vatransitmodernization.com. And again, I'd just like to thank you all for joining us today.